This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
So let's start by working through these questions of compliance and effectiveness in these two cases that you've now read. You've read the legal treaties, which are really the starting point for most good analysis in this area, and then you've read some very interesting commentaries on these. And we're going to be talking about questions that are, on the one hand, embarrassingly simple. What's the difference between effectiveness and compliance? Which seems like a really simple issue. It's easy to understand it. You can sort of talk about it for a couple of minutes. You get the basic ideas, and then that's it. And yet, on the other hand, are fundamentally important. And so I hope by the end of our discussion this morning that if you become involved in analyzing these kinds of agreements, or you become involved in writing and negotiating these agreements, these are the issues that you need to have right at the center on day one when you think about what is it we're trying to do. We've got some environmental problem we're trying to solve. What is the difference between the effectiveness of these international regimes we're setting up and the formal compliance with the rules that we're actually negotiating? Those questions are so fundamental, and they become really important in ways that I'm not sure you appreciate right now, but maybe by the end we will have peeled that onion enough to see how people's different ideas about these concepts just dramatically affect what happens. And they explain a lot of why international environmental law doesn't come anywhere nearly close enough to meeting its real potential, because people don't understand the difference between effectiveness, which is solving the problem at hand, and formal compliance. So let's start by talking about the cases that we have in front of us. Let's start with, these are two really interesting cases for a lot of reasons that I'm sure are clear from your reading, but they're interesting for analysts because quite often it's really hard in international law to know what compliance means, because the lawyers and diplomats, especially the diplomats, they get paid to obscure things and to write really complicated treaties so that you can read them and you have no clue what they really mean, and they worry about commas and clauses and so on. And all these things have special meanings, and so it's very, very difficult to know, well, did you actually comply with the treaty or not? For example, does anyone know what the main commitments in the Framework Convention on Climate Change are? Any idea?
Isn't it 7% reduction?
So that's the Kyoto Protocol for the United States. But the Kyoto Protocol, which is a specific treaty with specific commitments, sits under an umbrella called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Anyone know what what are called the Article 4 commitments? What does it say?
Protect the atmosphere.
Yeah, so you got to protect the atmosphere. Okay, that's great. Any other commitments?
Reduce greenhouse gases.
Yeah. Now, reduced by how much? What percentage?
Nothing.
Okay.
It doesn't give a number.
Okay, but it says something like, shall demonstrate that the industrialized countries shall demonstrate that they're taking the lead in dealing with this problem and endeavor to return their greenhouse gas emissions to levels earlier in the decade. Well, what does that mean? Nobody has a clue. That's why it was negotiated and agreed to. So if we actually try to do a study measuring compliance with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, other than the truly objective commitments, which are to submit reports, which you can do by basically taking a bunch of documents that are on the shelf with a big stapler and staple them together and mail them off to, at that time, the Secretariat in Geneva, other than that obligation, basically you just have to have a pulse and you're in compliance with that treaty. And so that's one of the difficult things. But these two agreements that we're going to be looking at today are very different, because for most of their history they've had specific quantified commitments, and we've had data. There are questions about the accuracy of the data that I'll talk a little bit about, and we've had data. So we can really measure compliance with these things, and that gets folks who study this stuff really riled up, myself included. This is one of the great examples, and this is the whaling treaty. Now, electronically, what can we do? Can we shut off the front lights, or is that?
No, ideally, if we can just go with the way.
Okay. Okay.
All of you have seen this off the web anyway. I mean, the equivalent of this off the web anyway, so.
Now, before we talk about the actual compliance with the Whaling Convention, what is the objective? What are the goals of the Whaling Convention? So if we're interested in knowing, is the Whaling Convention really achieving its ultimate goals, we have to know what those goals are. What are they?
Maintain commercially viable stocks of whales.
Okay, so let me just rephrase it a little bit. To promote the orderly development of the whaling industry, right, which in part includes maintaining commercially viable stocks of these whales. So what kind of evidence would we be looking for to know whether or not this convention is actually meeting its objectives? What kind of evidence? Yeah?
The amount of whales they took comply with the quotas they were given.
Okay. Now people agree with that?
No, not.
Why not?
Because the quotas might have been set by the industry itself.
Yeah, like the fox might be guarding the chicken coop, and so the quotas may not be the right thing. So what kind of evidence? Let's step back. Take the bigger picture. What kind of evidence we need to find?
Balance in how many or continuance in the amount of whales.
Okay, so whether or not one way to know whether or not this is meeting its goals is whether or not we see some kind of a sustainable population of whales out there. And another way we might know if the convention is meeting its goals is whether there's a vibrant and orderly whaling industry. Whether, as you graduate from Stanford University, you think, okay, I'm going to go into investment banking, or I'm going to go into management consulting, or I'm going to go into whaling. And, it's a serious industry, and we think about this as a kind of career option. So that's another way to know whether or not the convention is meeting its goals. As you probably know, in that sense, the Whaling Convention has been just a complete disastrous failure. The whaling industry in the world is on the ropes, except in a few countries. And it's no longer sexy to be in the whaling business, except in a few countries. So let's keep that in mind as to what the big goals of this are as we start talking about specific compliance with specific commitments under this convention. Now, here's the data that you've seen already. Let me just recap to make sure everybody's on the same page. Here we have on the horizontal axis time, year, and on the vertical axis we have numbers of whales caught. And what this chart shows is the actual, all these jagged lines here, is the actual self-reported catch of whales. And there's problems with self-reported data, as I know you've discussed. This is the actual catch of whales in the Antarctic region. This doesn't include the North Atlantic whaling, it doesn't include coastal whaling and so on. This is just the Antarctic region, which is the big whaling resource and also has been managed as a single resource, and so it's interesting to look at compliance levels in that area. So for example, the blue line is for blue whales. If you're a blue whale, the 1930 was exactly the wrong time to be alive. Over 30,000 blue whales killed in 1930 alone. It's just an incredible slaughter. During the 1940s, essentially no whaling took place because the whaling ships were engaged in the war, or they were at the bottom of the ocean because they'd been sunk because of the war, or they were stuck in port because it was too dangerous to move around. So almost no whaling activity. After the end of the after the end of the Second World War, you see a continued decline in the blue whale catch, driven principally because blue whales were becoming more and more scarce. So the largest whales are the easiest to capture, and so if everything else is equal, you go after blue whales because you get the most meat and oil and so on from that. And then it's replaced by other whales and so on. What's interesting from this experience is that until the late 60s and early 70s, really the late 60s, this fishery, this resource was managed as a single resource where all these different whales had a conversion factor, a so-called blue whale unit, which was based originally on the oil content of the whale. And so a blue whale counted as one, and a humpback whale, you had to catch 2.5 humpback whales, I think it was 2.5 humpback whales to equal one blue whale. And so you came up with a total quota. And the quotas for a long time were set in blue whale units rather than on an individual species basis. Now this is an extraordinarily stupid way to manage a resource. Why is that? Any ideas?
Some species are more endangered than others.
Right, because it's not that the blue whales and the humpback whales get together and produce another kind of whale. You need to manage the whales in individual species because that's the way the whales reproduce. That's the nature of the resource. Any ideas as to why they would manage the resource with a single quota, these blue whale units? Any ideas why they would do that? I mean, Fisheries 101 says this is a stupid way to do it. The famous articles in fisheries management came out in the 50s. The basic principles were known earlier. It's not like these guys were completely unaware. Any ideas?
Wasn't that pushed on pretty hard by the industry?
Gee, why would the industry have an interest in this?
Just because it sort of allowed them to keep catch high or keep total blue whale units or their total resource high. While sort of restricting catch, per se.
What do you mean by restricting catch?
So they don't catch as many blue whales, but they get the exact same amount of harvest by catching a bunch more humpback whales or things like that. So it seems like they're complying with some sort of international agreement, and yet they're sort of depleting the stocks even more.
Okay, so they want to create some kind of fig leaf that this problem is being dealt with. Well, why did they bother to create an agreement at all? Was it that Greenpeace was knocking on the door in the early 1960s, late 1950s, and said, you guys have to do something about this, so they created this agreement in order to look like they're dealing with a problem? Is that consistent with history? No. So why did they create the agreement at all? Any ideas?
I mean, they wanted to limit it among themselves, like divide the booty among themselves.
Okay. Okay, so one explanation, there's not a single answer to this question. One explanation is that what they're trying to do is take an existing resource and carve it up amongst themselves and prevent other countries from entering into that resource. So you're using regulation to create a kind of oligopoly. That's one plausible theory. Any other ideas as to why they're doing this? You should be asking these questions as to why. I mean, you will know by the end of this course good ways and bad ways to manage resources, and you go out and look at the real world and you see a lot of bad ways and some good ways. You've got to ask yourself, duh, why has this happened? Any other ideas? Who was a big pusher for this treaty? When did the treaty come into effect? The Whaling Convention.
49.
Okay, so what happened before 1949? Any major events happened early in the 40s?
World War.
Yeah, like a war. What was one of the outcomes of the war?
The U.S. won.
The U.S. won.
Germany lost.
Okay, next week we will be doing...
Okay. There are some courses on world history, I think, being taught elsewhere in this building. So now the U.S. then wins, and what does it want to do? Why is the U.S. heavily involved in putting together this convention? Ask yourself always when you go look at a treaty, why is that thing there? Any ideas? Why is this there? Was it that the people had nothing better to do and they were just sitting around at a club in Washington and they said, let's make a treaty? Probably not. Why?
Maybe to sort of limit the power of like the USSR and Japan, sort of nations that were huge whalers.
That's a possible theory, but does that stand up to the evidence? Why not? Yeah, well, Japan and the Soviet Union were some of the biggest whalers, and they were part of the system. Japan was not a huge threat in the late 1940s. I point out, the United States had occupied the country and had written the Constitution and done other things, and so there was not a huge threat. Why do you think the U.S. is involved with this? Well, one theory might be that the United States saw that we have this huge resource out there. It was well known how valuable this resource was because whaling, as you know from the readings in this class, had been going on long before the 1940s. And this resource needed to be managed properly. Why is the United States interested in managing this resource properly? Why didn't Iceland come in and say, everybody come to Reykjavik and we'll make a treaty?
Maybe because if they don't do it, someone else will come in.
Yeah. Somebody else will come in. Like who?
Like stay Russia or.
Okay,
it's
so
more, it's more of a political statement, I guess you could say.
what kind of political statement? What are they trying to say?
It's the U.S. showing that you can't overcome our power because we're the most powerful country in the world. So, for them entering this agreement, it shows that, I guess, I don't know, their political power, their placement in the world.
Okay, any other ideas on this? What is the U.S. national interest in doing this? The folks in Iowa are starving because they don't have enough whale meat, and so they want to deliver more whales to Iowa? What's the U.S. national interest? I think there are two. One is the U.S. had a whaling fleet at this time. That's one. And the other one is that this is a potentially enormously valuable source of, at this point, really not fuel and some specialty products, but food and protein for the world. In Japan, this was an enormous source of, whales were an enormous source of protein through the 1950s and early 1960s. And to some degree, part of the continued demand for whale meat in Japan is driven by a very old cohort, an older cohort of people who remembered and developed some taste for this product. That's not all of what's going on. So that's why the United States is involved in developing this. And why could the United States do this, but Iceland couldn't? Why?
They were hegemon. They were the biggest.
Okay, so the United States is the hegemon. And this happens in a lot of agreements, that you see a single very strong country or a small group of very strong countries that take on management of a resource because they want to promote development of the resource and they want to protect the resource, and there are often altruistic reasons there as well. And so they set up some kind of treaty, a convention, in order to deal with the problem at hand. That's what's going on with global warming. That's what happened with the ozone layer, and a bunch of other examples that you've looked at or will look at in this class. So now let's look at the actual record. So here we see the actual record. The quotas that were set in Antarctica until the mid-1960s were set in blue whale units. And those quotas are shown in the dark red, in the broad red lines here, the actual quotas. And this black line here shows the actual catch of whales, which you get by adding up the catch of the individual whales and then multiplying by these exchange rates, these blue whale units. What does this record show you here about compliance? What's the compliance level in this regime? High, low, what? What does it say?
It's low.
It's low. Why? Defend that.
Well, because the levels are really high right after the treaty was made.
Okay, well, you mean right here. So this is the quota level, the red line, and this is the actual catch. And your argument is the actual catch is above the red line, so compliance is low. But it's above the line by only a few percent, 5–10%. It's actually pretty remarkable when you think about it. Here we have 50,000 blue whale unit equivalents as a quota, and there's a remarkable correspondence between these two. My interpretation of this history is that compliance is actually pretty high, and that the actual catch of whales is pretty correlated with these quotas. For example, here the quotas dip down, the catch of whales dips down. What do you think is going on there?
They set the quotas too high.
What?
They set the quotas too high. Or like they weren't really, wasn't that sort of one of the problems? Because a lot of times the quotas were set too high in the whaling industry. They couldn't even get that many whales. They just were.
Okay, so that's one explanation, is they're setting the quotas too high. Let me reframe that a little bit to sharpen the point, which is that they're setting the quotas at the level that they want to catch or higher. So when you come to the quota negotiation, you say, well, how many whales am I going to get this year? And you say, that's my minimum, my absolute demand, and I'm not going to agree to anything unless I get this many whales. And all the other parties come to the negotiation, they say the same thing. And so what is the quota? The quota basically reflects what everyone was going to do anyway. Now let me just make a technical point here. Did they actually set quotas on a nation-by-nation basis? How did they do quotas?
You're supposed to call into the secretariat or something like that. Wasn't it to say what you caught? Was it on a weekly basis and then on a daily basis or something?
Okay, more points on this? Yeah, so now that's how they actually reported the data. How were the quotas set? Were they set on a nation-by-nation basis? No.
You had an overall quota with a set season.
Okay, so you had a total quota, and then how would you know when the quota had been filled up? This goes to your point.
When all the information, the database wherever they had it was said that the quota had been filled up when people were sending in information saying they caught a certain amount of
Okay,
whales.
so on a regular basis, the whaling ships are actually reporting data, and if your quota is 50,000, then day by day, as more of these whales get killed, the available quota gets smaller and smaller and smaller until finally it's over, and then that's it. They call off the season, right? What kind of behavior does that lead to?
Rates for a rush to fill the quota.
Right, what some people call the whaling Olympics, where you show up and kill as many whales as possible in a limited amount of time. Now, what kind of impact does that have on the economics of the industry?
It's a huge investment in the industry because you want the best materials to go so you can catch as many whales as fast as possible.
Okay, so you end up with an industry that's oriented around catching whales as rapidly as possible. Is that good news? If you're looking at this and you say, what would be economically the most optimal approach? Is that good news?
Definitely sort of limits like the supply of whales, so you get the price like sort of low when all the whales are caught, and then the price of whale meat sort of skyrockets once the season is over and there's no more whales out there in the market.
Okay, that's one effect. What about the capitalization of the industry? Does it lead to the right, if you were to manage this resource in an optimal way, would you have the same level of capital investment that you have in this whaling Olympics scene? Why not? What would you do if you were czar of the whales for a year? What would you do?
I think it goes back to what Kari was saying, is that they sort of invest in like the best technology, the most boats possible to catch the most whales in a small amount of time.
Right. So you end up with an industry that's overcapitalized, where you've spent much too much on capital equipment, and it would be more rational if we could all get together to have a lower capital investment and to spread it out over a longer period of time. This happens in a lot of fisheries regimes. You end up with fisheries being overcapitalized because of the way the rules have actually been written. We've just been discussing how the peculiarities of the rules that are set in this case led to this kind of behavior in the whaling regime. Now I want to ask you a question here. Starting here in the 1960s, you see a dramatic drop in the catch of whales. And you also see a dramatic drop in the quotas. Is this evidence that finally these yahoos in the International Whaling Commission understood that what they were doing was stupid and that they had been setting quotas too high, and so they needed to bring quotas down in order to promote the orderly development of the whaling industry, which is the whole objective of this? Is that what this is evidence of? No? So what's it evidence of?
Isn't that when the stocks crashed?
Okay, so a little bit of this may be evidence that the stocks are actually crashing. Okay, what else might this be evidence of?
It could also mean that there just aren't that many. It could also mean that there just aren't that many whales.
Yeah, that's the stocks crashing.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm not sure how often they set the quotas, but the quotas can be reactive to trends in catches. If you see the catches just drop one year, you're obviously going to set the quotas a lot lower the next year. Just kind of follow the trend.
Okay, let's come back to that point in just a second. But what else? What do you think is going on that would explain why the catch of whales would be dropping here?
There's a lot of market exits from the market.
Okay, why are whaling companies exiting from the market?
It was too expensive to catch that many whales, and the price of whale oil dropped.
Okay.
Or there were substitutes for whale fuel as fuel.
Okay, now a lot of the substitutes for whale oil as fuel occurred with petroleum in the 19th century, although there was some specialty product substitution.
The price dropped.
Okay. Any other ideas?
Maybe there's like more public awareness of what was going on, and so like just public pressure to lower their quotas and stop killing so many whales.
Okay. So the taste for whales is changing because of these public movements, which are in fact beginning in the 1960s. They really took full form in the 1970s with the Greenpeace and the other environmental groups. But there's some of that is starting in the 1960s because the environmental movement is really taking form in the 1960s.
I think another thing you have to realize is like these are all self-reported data, so like it's really easy to make this sort of whaling data match the quotas if you just tell the committees what you want them to hear and don't actually.
Okay, so I think if I could just recap for a moment, then we'll move on. I think part of what we're seeing here is that the whaling activity is being driven by the market and by countries and whaling firms' own interests, and then they're setting the quotas to reflect those interests. And then a little bit of what we're seeing here is falsification of the data in order to make sure that there's a real complete correspondence between the actual quota level and the catch of whales. It's a very interesting test of that In the early 1960s, there was so much acrimony in the International Whaling Commission, they couldn't agree on what the quotas were. So we have no quota for a couple of years in the early 1960s. You see the gap here. Now here's the actual catch of whales during that time. So this, and you see it dip up a little bit here. One way of interpreting that is these are the only times when there's no incentive to really lie about the data. So this is when you see the whaling industry do exactly what it would have done anyway without any quotas. And you see that the uptick of about 5 or 10%. So that suggests that there was a 5 or 10% systematic lying in the data. But that, I think more importantly, that it wasn't that huge. It's difficult to explain this drop in the actual catch of whales as simply falsification of the data. Because it's extremely unlikely that firms would be reporting 10,000 blue whale units of catch per year, and they would actually be catching 50,000 blue whale units per year, because there'd be a lot of whales out there in the market that you'd have some sense about. We have stories about falsification of data, especially from the Soviet Union, to some degree from Japan, but nothing on this scale. There's no way to explain this in terms of falsification of data. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just make 2 points. One, it goes back to the point Mark raised and that was raised earlier. And you don't see it as clearly on this, but if you look at the chart that's on the web, you know, that has the balls on it, you can actually, well, you tend to look at these charts as what's the quota, and you look for the catch underneath it, right? And that's compliance, or if it's above, it's non-compliance. But if you actually look, going to the point of were they setting quotas that match what they could catch, you'll also notice move left to right, and the causal arrow changes. The quota is a function of the previous year's catch, not the catch being a function of this year's quota. You know, you'll see that the quota in each year is almost equivalent to the catch in the previous year. So you just say, how much did we catch last year? We'll make that our quota for next year. Then we won't, because we've already driven down the number of whales out there. We won't be able to catch it. The other thing is this is just to push you to think about causal analysis. There was actually, if I'm pretty sure, there was a 1937 whaling agreement.
Yeah.
So the question is, we look at this chart and we try to explain this, and we're going to explain it by reference to the treaty. What about if we had a chart like that? Wow, wasn't that a great success? And we look at this 1937 treaty and we see this great, something like the blue whale units, the quota up here, right? And it comes down like that. And look, perfect compliance, right? Well, you should be, we already went through this. Rival hypothesis. There's this thing, it's called World War II. It happened. Tends to get ships out of the market, right? It had nothing to do with the treaty. So it's just always keep track of what else happened at the same point in time that can do an alternative explanation. And if you put up World War II or this treaty, which one wins, right? So I think just to kind of make that point more clearly, look at what a wonderful success this was, right? You can tell the whole story, and if you're not kind of attentive to what's the alternative explanation, you don't see it.
So in general, war is very bad for the environment unless you're a whale, and then war is good for the environment. I'm not sure about the new style of doing war, but with precision munitions. But it was bad. It was good for the whales in the 1940s. So that's the case there with the whaling convention. We've talked some about it. I think the basic story is high compliance and what? What about effectiveness?
Poor effectiveness.
Poor effectiveness. Why?
Because you aren't at sustainable yields. The levels of whales. The whale population was not. It wasn't sustainably managed, which was the goal, or the explicit goal.
Okay, so the resource was not sustainably managed, and that was the goal. Was that the goal? The real goal. That was part of the goal, but the central goal of this was to promote the orderly development of the whaling industry. Was the lack of management of the whale resource the reason the whaling industry went out of business? No. What's the reason? It's part of the reason, certainly. It's harder to get whales, and that explains part of it. What's the central reason the whaling industry went out of business?
You've got a change in, what was originally the founding tenets of the commission, which was, like you said, orderly development of the industry, to their kind of newfound position of, protecting whales from the absolute utilization due to changing, like you said, the whale taste. Right now you have, the moratorium, and you have, the regime on the, potential verge of collapse because of withdrawal of key members. I mean, if you look at it that way, you've got a whole basis on which to judge, the actual effectiveness of the regime.
Right, and so if you start a study on the whaling regime and you want to judge the effectiveness, and then the question becomes, by what standard are we going to judge the effectiveness? You have to change that standard right in the middle of your whole study. Because until the early 1970s, this was just a producer's club. Nobody went to the Whaling Commission meetings except for government bureaucrats and whalers. And the government bureaucrats and the whalers were often the same people. And so they set the standards according to what they wanted. They mismanaged this resource. There's no question about it. They mismanaged the resource, and that's part of the reason why whaling went out as quickly as it did. But the main reason is that the underlying interests, the underlying political interests that sustained the regime changed. And that has nothing to do with the operation of the treaty. If anything, the treaty helped change those underlying interests, because when Greenpeace and the others came in, they could say, this is an example, this treaty, this convention is an example of what's wrong with the world, because it's a bunch of foxes guarding the chicken coop. And so we need to blow up these kinds of treaties and these kinds of arrangements in order to get to a more sustainable world. And so, ironically, the treaty itself helped undo its original purpose.
They also talk about effective conservation of whale stocks too, though, in the treaty. And I don't think that looks like effective conservation.
No, I agree with you completely. But the central objective was the development of the whaling industry. Let's just talk briefly about the whaling industry today. As you mentioned, there's a moratorium on whaling that's in place. And yet, if you go out and count up the number of whales caught every year, it's on the order of a couple thousand, depending on what Norway does and what Japan does with its so-called scientific whaling program. Is that an evidence? This history that we've talked about until now has been basically a history of very high or often perfect levels of compliance, but very low effectiveness. Now we've got the moratorium in place, which presumably means don't whale, and you've got these countries out there whaling, a couple thousand whales a year. Iceland is out, but Iceland has shut down its whaling industry, so they're not a factor. So is that an example now of low compliance? Any ideas?
Actually, I mean, in terms strictly of compliance, you have Norway, which opted out, formally opposed the moratorium, so they're not legally in default as far as compliance goes. And you've still got, scientific permits, so in the case of Japan, for instance. So
Right.
you've got to be really
Right.
strict about your notion of
Exactly.
Exactly.
But in the legal sense, because Norway took a reservation on the moratorium in 1982, they're in compliance. And they're in compliance in part because of the reservation, in part because they submit every year their whaling plans. And Japan is in compliance because the scientific whaling that it does through the scientific committee by submitting the plans and so on. So we have in this whole history almost perfect levels of compliance. We have argued that the effectiveness of this agreement through this period here has been very low, and that the real driving forces in the industry are actually completely outside the regime. They have to do with changing tastes. Is the effectiveness of the Whaling Convention today high or low? We've talked about compliance with it. Compliance with the whaling regime today is perfect in the legal sense, although there is still this whaling of a couple thousand whales. But does the Whaling Convention have an impact on the behavior of countries that would otherwise be whaling? That's the question of effectiveness. That's the key issue right now. You wrote an essay about it for this class.
Relative or absolute effectiveness, in terms of the achievement of stated goals or the actual preservation of whales, at a sustainable level.
Does the existence of the Whaling Convention and the International Whaling Committee today, the existence and the operation of them, do they have an impact on the behavior of whaling states? What kind of impact?
In the sense that every state is required to continue to send in information or continue, like the regime sort of is almost like it's taken a while, but it seems like the regime has sort of come into its own in in what it actually can control, that it is able to sort of collect proper data, it has proper measurements. Like it took the scientific committee forever to figure it out, but they have sort of finally come to some sort of conclusion.
So
that
how
actually makes it effective.
But they haven't come to some kind of conclusion. They keep coming up with these schemes and programs, and then no one can agree on the schemes or the programs, so they move the goalposts another step, and we still can't get some kind of a management scheme in place, formally agreed by everyone, in order to resume commercial whaling.
We still have the data coming in, so the states are still complying, even though they're sort of...
Now, the states are still complying, but is it having an effect on what the states are doing?
You have
That's
to
the
look
question.
at whether Japan and Norway, Japan at least, without the scientific research loophole, what they would be catching.
That's the question. That's just like counterfactual. So what do you think Japan would be doing if the Whaling Commission didn't exist? If they weren't forced...
Say counterfactual.
What?
I'd hate you to say counterfactual.
Oh, okay. I'll take my stock options afterwards. Go long. So that's the counterfactual. What do you think? What do you think's the answer? What would Japan do? Let's take Japan, then we'll take Norway. What would Japan do?
I would think the countries would kill all the whales, just because like it's more economically feasible to
Dynamite.
kill all the whales, take all the
Nuclear
money, and then
weapons.
like put it in the bank or something. Just because like you could probably get more interest in banks than you could on like how fast whales reproduce.
Okay, so that's one theory, is that Japan would go out with a gigantic whaling program if they weren't constrained by this convention, and empty the oceans of whales and invest in e-toys or something else maybe. Any other ideas? What do you think Japan would do? I mean, that's an extreme case, but the point is that they would do a lot more whaling. Does that seem plausible?
Maybe. I mean, you have to see what Japanese consumers are, what their taste, whether that complete the demand side for whaling, like what that for whales, what that looks like.
You have to do that, and I think if you did that, you'd find that there is some significant amount of unmet demand. Demand is not just a single number, but it's a function of price. But if prices were lower, there would be more demand for this. So you could paint a story that Japan would engage in not emptying the oceans of whales, but would at least engage in more whaling, if not for this convention. Now, is it because of the legal force of the convention that they're not doing more whaling? I think the real reason is that they have to go to all these meetings and present these scientific plans and explain what thare doing. And that's how the convention is working now. So this is I've been going on much longer than I had anticipated, but these are the questions you have to ask. You have to look at cause and effect and ask, by what mechanism is this convention actually having an influence? And I think the argument today is it's having an influence not by setting particular quotas and numbers and so on, but it's having an influence by creating a forum at which everybody shows up. Most of the people who show up don't do any whaling. And it's sort of comical when Switzerland shows up, and Switzerland's landlocked, in case you didn't know. Not a lot of whales in Switzerland, so you wouldn't think that they'd have an interest in this. But all these countries show up, and most of them have no interest in this other than the environmental and the aesthetic value of the whales. But those countries that engage in whaling have to come and defend what they're going to do. And so there's all this pressure, this diplomatic pressure, to do less whaling and to do only things that can be justifiable. Norway is a case in point. Norway, under Brundtland, who was the architect of Our Common Future, this important report on sustainable development, she personally led Norway's effort to restart whaling because of her conviction that you should be able to use resources in a sustainable way. And whales are just another resource. And so Norway has some of the best scientific data in the world in order to defend the catches that they actually engage in. And so when they go to the Whaling Commission meetings, they've got all this information about what they're doing and why and what the sustainable level is and why killing 1,500 or 2,000 minke whales doesn't affect a world population of 500,000 to 1 million minke whales, and on and on and on. But I think there's no question that Norway is doing less whaling now than they would do if they didn't have to come and defend these kinds of activities. One last point on this. Okay, suppose we buy this argument and we blow up the International Whaling Commission because we're interested in promoting more whaling. Japan goes out there and starts doing more whaling. What's going to happen? Do they have a free ride now? And so if we were to stop this convention, we would have no influence on what Japan does? What do you think would happen? Norway goes out there. They're not killing 2,000 minke whales anymore. They're going to kill 200,000 next year. That's implausible. 20,000. That's not implausible. What's going to happen?
Maybe something along the lines of what the U.S. did in the 70s with the economic sanctions. against countries that are violating the Wildlife Conservation Act.
Exactly the same legal basis. The United States last year began the process of certifying Japan because the United States especially didn't like the idea that Japan's scientific whaling program was going to include not only minke whales but also sperm whales, which are endangered and also have special charismatic value because of Moby Dick and so on. No, this is a big deal. But there's an argument as to why Japan should not be engaged in killing, albeit 10 sperm whales. And so the United States started the process of sanctioning Japan on this. So what do you think Japan would do in response? What? What would they do?
Those sanctions back.
They what?
Have their own trade sanctions.
So they try and then sanction the United States, okay. You think they're going to get away with that?
Well, the United States exports an extreme amount of Pacific fish to Japan, so yeah, it's going to have an impact.
Okay, so maybe Japan has a little bit of leverage over the United States. What do you think the United States would do in response?
Create some other trade sanctions.
Yeah, create some other trade sanctions. Then we have a little trade war going here about the whales, about 10 sperm whales, which is a possible future. Now, in trade wars, it tends to be that the big kid on the block wins. So knowing that, what do you think Japan's going to do? Slow down their whaling. So maybe even if we blew up this whole treaty, the whole system would stay in place and the actual catch of whales wouldn't change very much. Not because of the treaty, but because in addition to the treaty, you have the big kid on the block, the United States, is also very keen on enforcing wildlife laws. Why? Why is the United States? Is George Bush suddenly turned a whale lover? Why do you think the United States is interested in enforcing these whale laws?
It's kind of good PR for them because it's not really an industry that we have any investment in, but we can still go out and look as if we're really really green or environmental by saying we want to protect it.
Okay, but now what PR benefit do we get?
That we're protecting the environment.
And what benefit does that have?
Well, it looks good to the green or to the people in our government that are pushing for green movements or.
Yeah, and there are all these people in America called voters who care about whales, and a lot of them have the whale songs records on the shelf and all that stuff, and they really care about this. And so this is an enormous political force that's focused on the whales, that believes, if you ask them in unstructured polls, what's going on with the whales, they believe that the last whale is just about to be caught and there aren't any more whales in the world, which is just completely at odds with the reality for minke whales, which is what almost all the whaling is focused on right now. The world is just awash in minke whales. But this is a really political force that you can then gain benefits from, political benefits, at essentially no cost. So that's all I wanted to say. So it remains unclear to me how effective the Whaling Convention is today because of this backstop of United States sanctions and the threats of United States sanctions. And this is the really hard business of trying to unravel, in good research, trying to unravel what is cause and effect. And you have to look far beyond the legal text at what's actually going on. Shall I talk a little bit about the ozone?
Yeah, do the ozone quick and then lay out the background on the ozone and then we can see if we can get it relevant.
Okay, great. So we have another story here about ozone depletion. Not a great slide. I apologize for that. Ron sent me
Got it from me.
No, I got the data from you, but the printing is entirely me, and the printing is the problem. In any case, we have on the horizontal axis here time, again, from the 1984 up through about the year 2000. The Montreal Protocol is the treaty about ozone depletion. It was signed originally in 1987. It sets specific targets and timetables for the consumption of ozone-depleting substances, chlorofluorocarbons, halons, and a bunch of other stuff. It's another one of these great treaties to study because it has specific quantified targets and timetables, and we have data about what's really going on. Again, we have some data problems. Again, the data problems show up especially in Russia and Ukraine and so on. Why do you think that is, by the way? Why is it that we have all these data problems, that Russia ends up being a source of the data problems, Lebanon's a source of the data problems here, Saudi Arabia is potentially, Kuwait is potentially? Why are these countries systematically sources of data problems, but the countries, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, tend not to be sources of data problems in these treaties? Why do you think that is?
There's greater political stability.
Okay, so stability might be a factor. Anything more along those lines? political stability.
You said sort of like the U.S. and Canada might have more monitoring groups like environmental NGOs that are sort of like watching the industries and doing
Right. We often analysts call these liberal democratic countries, and so these are countries in which there are lots of political forces at work, and the state, the government, is actually weak. Relatively speaking, the government of the United States is weak compared with the government in Saudi Arabia, the government in Kuwait, and other non-liberal countries. And so it's very difficult for the government to behave strategically and to lie about information that's also available fully or partially in the public record. And so that's one reason why the reporting records and the quality of the data that comes from these advanced liberal countries, market-based democracies typically, is better than in non-liberal countries. And that also explains a lot of why these advanced the liberal countries comply with these environmental treaties much more than the non-liberal countries, because they're under a lot of internal public pressure to comply. It's not because there's some international police force run by Kofi Annan, which is going to swoop in the famous black helicopters from the UN and take over Washington if Washington doesn't comply with its environmental treaties. It's because of internal public pressure that forces these countries to comply. And the same story in data. But here's the data that we have reported from the so-called non-Article 5 countries. These are the advanced industrialized countries and the reforming countries in Russia and Eastern Europe. The black line here shows the actual obligations of the Kyoto Protocol for chlorofluorocarbons, which is the most important class of ozone-depleting substances. And this blue line that you can't see, so you're going to have to take my word for it that it exists, this blue line here shows the actual consumption of ozone-depleting substances. And what's the message here about compliance?
Very high.
Very high. Perfect. Over-compliance, in fact. Every single year for which we have data, the actual consumption of chlorofluorocarbons is lower than the target. Now, is this another case, like the whaling case, where countries knew what they were going to do anyway, and so they just set the quotas at that high level? Any ideas? No? Why not?
Because they would have continued to manufacture CFCs. I mean, in fact, the CFC industry was booming. It was expanding, not shrinking. So if you saw the trend, it would keep going up, not down.
Okay.
If without regulation.
So when the countries set into place the quotas for individual countries for consumption of chlorofluorocarbons, they weren't just saying, here are some quotas that happen to mirror what we're going to do anyway, and watch how wonderful we are as we comply, but they're actually quotas that require them to do something different from what they would have done otherwise. So here we have a case that's very different from the Whaling Convention, where we have high levels of compliance, but also, it appears, high levels of effectiveness, right?
Notice this is why I require you to have 5 years of data before your treaty, right? It'd be nice to be able to prove Monica's point, which is what this blue line was doing prior to. We want to know what's happening back here, and all the evidence is that Monica's right, that in fact the line here is something like that. So.
Now, if we've seen in this whaling example, the countries just tend to write international commitments that mirror what they're doing anyway, why didn't they do the same thing in this case? Why didn't they just set quotas that kept on going up, and then they could pretend that they're doing something about the ozone layer problem when in fact they're doing nothing, and they get to declare high levels of compliance? So why didn't they do that? We've already talked about the answer a little bit. Why didn't they do that? Why does this treaty exist?
Well, there was sort of a crisis for the ozone hole.
Yeah, this is kind of a crisis. Right? This is a huge hole in the ozone layer. And in 1987, the fall of 1987, I remember this very well because I was working on the science of the ozone layer problem in the fall of 1987, we didn't know conclusively why there was a hole in the ozone layer. There were still plausible theories that it was an entirely natural phenomenon because we didn't have enough data going back, accurate data going back to know whether or not this was a natural cycle or caused by some kind of quirk in the weather, or whether this is something caused by chlorofluorocarbons. So they negotiated this treaty in the fall of 1997, finished it the fall of 1997, and the treaty said we're going to have a 50% cut in chlorofluorocarbons. Not a complete phase out, but in 1987 they said a 50% cut. Turns out that a 50% cut is more or less what you can achieve already without very much change in cost. For Europe, it was incredibly easy because Europe had not fully implemented a ban on chlorofluorocarbons in aerosols, and since that costs essentially nothing to do, and make sense anyway, they could comply with this treaty in their sleep. The United States could comply with the treaty fairly easily. So they didn't have perfect scientific information that this was a slam dunk. But they negotiated a treaty that at least went halfway towards solving the problem. Late that year, we had the first data from actual flights with a converted U-2 spy plane into the ozone hole, and it's as close to a slam dunk as you ever get in science. Wherever they measured high levels of chlorine monoxide, which is a derivative of the chlorofluorocarbons and other chemicals, they saw extremely low levels of ozone. Wherever chlorine monoxide was low, they had high levels of ozone. So there was a perfect anti-correlation that showed, open and shut, that chlorofluorocarbons and halons principally caused this problem. And then after that, all the politics fell into place afterwards. Now I'm going to stop here so we can have some discussion and think a little bit about how this might apply to climate or to other issues. But I just want to ask you one question. If the main force for the advanced industrialized countries complying with the ozone treaty is this internal public pressure that comes from these environmental groups and people being worried about the ozone layer, then why is it that the developing countries, if I put up this same chart that showed for the developing countries, the targets, the quotas, and the actual consumption, you see a similar pattern. Not quite as dramatic, but you see a similar pattern. Their commitments are further out into the future, but they're starting to take hold right now. Essentially every developing country, with the caveat that there are some data problems, essentially every developing country is on track to comply or over-comply massively with this treaty. Now, inside the developing countries, there aren't as many of these environmental groups. And insofar as they exist and they're active, they're working on local pollution problems like urban air pollution, dirty water, things like that. They're not working on the ozone layer. So they're not pressuring the governments to do something about the ozone layer. And yet all those governments are also complying. Why is that?
Sorry, in the case of the Montreal Protocol, they were getting funded by nations that actually...
Yeah, they're being paid, compensated. How much are they getting? Not in dollars amount, but anyone know how the compensation scheme is written? The industrialized countries pay the agreed incremental cost to the developing countries of complying with the treaty. So if you're a developing country and you're thinking, should I join this treaty and comply, or should I stay outside? If you join the treaty, what do you get? You get obligations to control your consumption of these ozone-depleting substances, but you get money to pay for all the projects, all the incremental cost of all the projects to comply. So the net effect is what? Approximately zero. If you stay outside the treaty, what happens? If you stay outside the treaty, you say, okay, well, it's zero to be inside the treaty, but I don't trust those industrialized countries. They're always lying and so on, all of which is more or less true. So why don't I just stay outside the treaty? What happens? Any ideas? What happens?
Sanctions.
Trade sanctions. Yeah, bummer. So then you get trade sanctions applied to you. If you're a country that's outside the convention, you have trade sanctions applied in order to compensate for the fact that you have not met the obligations that most of the other countries in the world would undertake. Now, so what was the calculation? If you're a smart, strategic country, what do? You join the treaty, and that explains why essentially every nation on earth has joined this treaty and is now complying with the treaty. And if the funds start to fall short, as they have periodically, what do? You don't implement as much. So you say, look, if you want us to implement, you have to pay us. You have to pay these projects. And so this is a very stable political agreement that is leading to solving the ozone layer problem. And it's a stable political agreement that for the advanced industrialized countries is built on the fact that the environmental groups are pressuring governments to do something about this. And for the developing countries is built on the fact that if you're inside the agreement, you get paid the agreed incremental cost of complying with it. And if you're outside the agreement or you violate the agreement, you get trade sanctions. And so all the incentives are all lined up in the same direction, and almost every country is now phasing out these emissions. That wouldn't be happening without the treaty. And so here's a case where we have very high levels of compliance and very high levels of effectiveness. Great. So I'm sorry to have taken so long to get through that.
Shall I sort of...
Yeah, do you want to...
Why don't we go through then? Let's just start with, I mean, and this is, again, I think both David and I would agree, I'll say that if he wants to disagree, he can, that in terms of then doing what I want to do in the last 20 minutes of class is to say, so which one was more effective? And I think we both agree that that's not a question that anybody's asking very frequently in this realm, and those who are haven't done a good job of it. You know, it's a hard question to get your hands around. And a lot of people have done what David just did in this kind of sequence, right? He said, let's talk about the whaling treaty. Did it work? Not. What can we attribute causally to the treaty? What can we attribute to other factors? Can do the same thing again on the ozone treaty. It's, you know, I mean, the ozone treaty has been worked over. I don't think there's a single word that hasn't been written on it yet. But nobody's really engaged in the question of which one worked better for any pair of treaties. You know, and I mean, there is some comparisons going around, and I think actually David's book from the with MIT Press on the effectiveness and operation of international environmental commitments does get at some of the comparisons, but it's still none of the stuff is saying which one worked better and trying to say everything else held constant. So first, let's just take a show of hands for starters. How many people think and let's make it a little bit interesting, let's say the whaling treaty now versus the ozone treaty now, right? So we can go back to other issues of getting back to this issue of over time it may have changed. But let's talk about the whaling treaty now and the ozone treaty now. How many people think the whaling treaty today is more effective? And we'll get into all the definitions, and I know you need all the answers to what do you mean by effective. Okay, but there's $100 sitting on the table for you to make a vote one way or the other of which one was more effective. So how many people think the whaling treaty in the year 2001 is more effective than the ozone treaty? How many people think the whaling treaty is? So whaling treaty people, hold your hand. You're gonna have to defend this later, so this will make it harder to vote. The $100 isn't free. Okay, so 4 people think the whaling. How many people think the ozone treaty is more effective? There should be whatever the total class size minus 4 is there. Okay, so whaling people. Why? What's your argument? And again, I don't think there's a right answer. David and I certainly don't know it. But why is the whaling? What would the argument be to say, here's why the whaling treaty is more effective? So you better talk about the ozone treaty as well.
Yeah. Well, if we're going based on just the regime itself, and I guess the standards of what the regime is supposed to do. When I wrote my paper, I originally thought the ozone regime was better than the whaling regime, but after listening today, I think based on the scientific consensus, the economic incentives, I thought that maybe CFCs could be reduced anyways without the regime.
Okay.
And so right now with the whaling treaty, I think that with scientists presenting all this data, going to the meetings and the forum, I think that it has created, it has induced change in behavior with other countries. And I think the ozone regime in itself has not induced behavior. It's been economic incentives, DuPont, having alternate substitutes, and the scientific consensus of the actual ozone layer being depleted, the actual metaphor of going out to the general public.
Okay. Sarah or Megan or was it Mark who was the fourth?
I would basically say that the whaling treaty now, the reason I would say it's more effective is because they've gone through more of a learning process, and they've had problems with illegal stuff, but then they implemented monitoring systems, and now they have a moratorium, and they have a real set sort of deal going on, and they've been able to deal with all this stuff. I would say the ozone right now, they still have a problem with the illegal CFC trade, and they haven't exactly figured out how to figure it out. I don't know if it's fair to compare them now, because one of them's a lot older and the other one's a lot newer, but at this point I think that the whaling treaty has dealt with its problems so far, and that the ozone still has some problems.
Okay, and Sarah's raising an interesting point, and Warren Young is the main person who's kind of pushed this notion that there may be life cycles to regimes. That they're kind of young and they don't know what they're doing and they make a lot of mistakes and they grow to maturity, and then presumably at some point they die because the problem's solved or or it's impossible to solve, or whatever. That would be a nice thing if we solved some of these problems, but not very likely. But right, so there may be a life cycle to these things.
Solve the horse manure problem.
We did solve the horse manure problem. Megan?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much my general feeling was just the gap between the requirements in the Montreal Treaty and the actual compliance is so large. It feels like if it's that easy for them to over comply, then the levels are probably set wrong.
Okay.
Whereas I felt like when you look at the graph of the whaling treaty, it actually looks like those quotas are holding the catch down, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you go a little over, but it looks like they're pretty much equal with each other. So that, to me, just, it felt like the treaty itself was having more to do with the number of whales being caught than the Montreal Treaty, where I felt like it was just a lot of public outcry that was really driving the CFCs down.
Is there any relationship between the quotas that are set and actual behavior? Suppose we set the speed limit out here in front of Sarah Mall at 200 miles an hour. Then presumably people would not be going right up to the speed limit. So there's a lot of overcompliance. Then we reduce the speed limit from 200 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour. Would people change their behavior?
Depends what you did to them, I suppose.
Everything else is the same. We just change the speed limit from 200 to 100. It's a similar kind of situation. The amount of overcompliance in the ozone case is so huge. You got to ask yourself, exactly as you've done, this is exactly the right question. Why do we have so much overcompliance?
And the other way to frame David's question is to say, how many of you went skiing this weekend up at Tahoe? And what was your average speed coming down from Tahoe? Right? And was that due to the speed limit being 65? Right? The average speed coming down from Tahoe, from what I can make out from people who were up there, was something like 22 miles an hour coming down I-80. And you could say, well, everybody was complying better than ever, right? There must have been a lot of cops on the road making people drive the speed limit. But it's exactly the right question of over-compliance due to other factors.
The reason I raise the question is because international law is a very weak instrument. It requires countries to ratify agreements and all this other stuff that you probably talked about, the legal process of creating an international law. So you've got these treaties and they're negotiated, everyone gets involved in the negotiation, and then these legislatures, these pesky legislatures like the Senate, have to ratify treaties in order for them to come into force. And that's why the levels of compliance are so high, because there are all these hurdles where everyone's asking, can we comply? And any treaty that doesn't meet that standard at every single one of these hurdles just gets thrown out. And that's why the system gravitates towards treaties that produce high levels of compliance. And that's why this difference between compliance and effectiveness in international law is such a big deal. Some people think that the mere existence of a treaty and some kind of a target, even if the target is much higher than actual behavior, is enough to produce all these kinds of political effects that result in changes in behavior. So that the overcompliance we see in the ozone regime, by that theory, would say the mere existence of these targets and the fact that the targets are coming down over time has focused a lot of political pressure on this behavior, and that's what's really going on here. Other people believe that these treaties are a little bit like national laws and regulations. They actually regulate behavior, and so the actual exact level of the quota matters, because then the firms organize their behavior or according to those specific levels. And those are just two different theories about how law works, which is at the center of this.
Okay, some people on the... Megan, please leave.
Wanted to say that I feel like the same sort of general crisis situation which made it possible to get the Montreal Treaty would have driven all of CFCs down anyway. It's the idea of, like, yes, we were all really, really worried about it, and there was a big crisis, and we would have done something about it whether or not there was a treaty, because the quotas aren't doing anything, so...
I think one of the good things that's coming out of the discussion today, and some of the points that were made when David was asking questions, is how hard it is to know about these counterfactuals. Megan just made a counterfactual claim. The question is how plausible is that claim? We have to kind of imagine the world without the treaty, but with all the science going on and all the New York Times articles, and then you have to say, well, but there would be fewer New York Times articles because part of what drives the people to write the articles is not merely the science, it's the negotiation, right? So you want to try to, how do you take it more than a 30-second kind of soundbite from Megan about, I think it's more plausible this, but rather actually develop an argument, and that's what I want to see you do in these papers, is how do you really know what the counterfactual would look like. And we're making a lot of counterfactual claims. You're always making them. It's nice to see you guys making them explicitly, to say this is what it would be like without it. But then you got to kind of build up the foundation underneath that to say, this is plausible. Eli and then Kari. And I want to get back to, okay, now get some people from the other side saying why whaling's more effective.
Right. I mean, yeah. I was just going to say that I think that's sort of a tough claim to make, considering that a lot of like what Alex was talking about was sort of like the economic alternatives and stuff like that. And I think a lot of the reason why those were developed, I'm not an expert, but was because sort of companies saw that, oh, look, we're going to get regulated. We might as well start now looking for other things. Whereas had the treaty not been sort of in the picture, these companies probably wouldn't have been like, oh, we're going to get regulated. They would have been, oh, we'll just keep producing what we're producing. Yeah, it's a problem, but there's a lot of problems in this world that people aren't like out there running to solve. So
there's an important point too, and I think this has come out a lot in what David's done, is David's put a lot of flesh on the bones of how treaties work, right? It's not, so this is a question of, a treaty may be effective, but by getting people to think they're going to be regulated, and then they go out and find alternatives, and then they go find alternatives that are cheaper, and then they sell those for cheaper, and all of a sudden we have behavior change. The treaty still made a difference, just not through this regulatory process, and if it wasn't there, it would have been different. So I think that's, again, you want to kind of be telling these stories, you know, these causal stories, and it's the how that things make a difference that's, as you know, is the more important part. That it makes a difference, that there's a correlation, is only 5% of the problem, 10% of the problem that you have to do. So the rest is that the argument. Kari.
I just had a question about something that Sarah was saying, in the sense that, like, how do you account in the treaty effectiveness as far as like illegal use of something? Like, it seemed in the whaling regime, like the treaty, there was a lot of illegal things going on, but at the same time, it was the treaty that was supposed to be regulating that. While in CFCs, it's like all the countries are complying, but there's something illegal happening, but it doesn't have anything to do with what's going on with the treaty. Do you see that?
It has everything to do with what's going on in the treaty.
But it's not actually like the nations are complying, and like there's actual sort of effectiveness going on as far as the treaty goes. But how, like, it's kind of like, it sort of seems like...
Well, that's actually tricky to answer. I know we're time is tight, because the treaty requires that you regulate, this is in the case of the ozone, that you regulate your consumption of chlorofluorocarbons at specific levels. And consumption is the actual production plus imports minus exports. It doesn't say anything about whether those imports and exports are legal or illegal. So by a literal reading of the law, if you had a huge amount of illegal trade, you would still be violating the agreement. And we're pretty certain that a significant amount of so-called illegal trade, meaning not reported by the government, was going on in Russia. Data are now pretty good about that. But what do you do? Because here you are sitting in Geneva or Paris, or have some kind of fancy meeting, and a diplomatic meeting, and the only source of information you have are these reports that are coming from these governments. And you can challenge the reports, but then with what alternative sources of information? And so that's why, even with illegal trade in ozone-depleting substances, the compliance records, that's one reason why the compliance records look as they do, because the illegal trade is not in the officially reported data. And any effort, whether it's drug control or ozone or chlorofluorocarbon control, if you make some kind of a lucrative activity illegal, then that produces a corresponding, although usually not as great, a corresponding black market traffic, and that's what's happened. So it has everything to do with what's going on inside the regime.
So in some way, do you feel like a treaty should account for that?
You can't. It's so impossible under international legal procedure to imagine how they would actually be able to do that. It's like a fantasy land. Jesse Helms worries that the UN is about to take over America. The reality is that in these international organizations, they're incredibly weak. They have no sources of independent data. When they do have a source of independent data, they can't really use it officially. Or they can raise it in an informal paper and say to the government, so what do you think about that? If the government then comes back and says, well, we don't believe those data, then that's the end of the story. Lebanon, for example, in the ozone depletion regime, submitted different population data. You'd think the population, how many people are in the country, that's a kind of objective number. They submitted different population data. Kuwait, I think, did the same. And at the end of the day, what did the regime do? It had to take the population data from the country, even though it had alternative data that the same countries had submitted to the UN for a different purpose that suggested a different population. That's life.
Okay, some people want to make the argument for the other side. Diana.
One of the things that interests me when I was trying to evaluate the overall effectiveness of each treaty was I called it the sustainability of each regime. Like I was concerned with the potential impacts of the moratorium on the Whaling Commission, and how you've got the rival regional regime, NAMCO, popping up and things like that. You don't see that in the Montreal Protocol because you have, at each COP meeting, you've got refining of schedules, you've got the introduction of new compounds, you've got, international agreements. You don't see new protocols popping up to deal with this problem. Whereas in the Whaling Commission, you've got concerns of members about, exclusion of, small cetaceans, and you've got, particular issues about the scientific commission can't make up its mind what's going on. The procedures that they're implementing aren't, achieving their stated goals. I just think you've got a lot more problems in the Whaling Commission, including the really, to me, important effective, is the regime going to collapse here, just any time? And you just don't see that kind of problem, aside from the fact of the illegal trading, which is something you're going to, find in a treaty, and you do find in every treaty because of the incentive for states to default. You still see overall compliance and effectiveness in the Montreal Protocol that you don't see in the Whaling Commission.
Somebody else, Malika?
This is what I said in my paper. In the year 2000, you basically eliminate both treaties. If you eliminated both regimes or treaties, and the environmental bad, you'd measure how much the environmental bad went up, and whichever went up by a greater amount, you'd say that treaty was more effective. That's how I would define it. And I would argue that if you took away the Montreal Protocol and you took away the whaling regime, the IWC, I'd say CFC consumption would shoot up much more in proportion to the number of whales being caught, because you're anyway in that zero cat, since Japan and Norway are outside anyway.
Okay.
But that's how I would look at it and say that that's why I argue that the Montreal Protocol is more effective.
Okay, so an interesting way to kind of pose the counterfactual, right? An interesting approach. Others on the whaling, saying ozone's more effective.
I think the ozone treaty is more effective. I think I would disagree with the last statement. Just, I feel like if you got rid of the Montreal Protocol, there's been so much stuff already put into it that you probably wouldn't see CFCs increase to such an amount. So I think that's sort of a bad way to do it. But I think looking at the whaling treaty and why that was sort of ineffective. If you hadn't had the treaty, I think you would still have seen increase in whaling, decrease in whale populations, and then everyone sort of getting together and being like, whoa, let's stop whaling for a little while and see if these stocks will come back, and then we can harvest them, even without sort of a regulation. I feel like countries sort of did exactly what they wanted to do anyway. In the whole whaling treaty, because of all the exclusions, you could be like, well, I'm the biggest hunter of sperm whales, and so I don't want to comply with any of the regulations on sperm whales, and that's totally fine. Which I think having sort of parts like that in your regulatory law just doesn't make much sense in general if you're trying to actually accomplish anything. Whereas the Montreal Protocol, pretty much everyone in the world, not everyone in the world, but most countries are now involved with it and complying with it. Okay.
Kate or Emily? And then Hanky, I'm calling on. Here I feel like I can cold call people since you actually wrote about this, so you should have a thing or two to say. I've set you up, Kate and Emily, so we'll let Hanky go first, and she actually offered, but both of you guys are up next. Hanky.
Well, I just think an underlying problem with both of these treaties is just the actual environmental problem that you're facing. And then in terms of ozone, people feel as though the viability of the planet is threatened. And when you look at whales, yeah, it's sad if there are no more whale species, that's bad for biodiversity, but it's not going to be this huge catastrophe. And I think that just in terms of effectiveness, I think that the Montreal Protocol was more effective because people were more threatened by the prospect of having increased UV radiation.
So is that an effect of the treaty or an effect of the problem? So does the treaty get credit and walk off the field here?
I think that the treaty was implemented and taken more seriously because of the magnitude of the problem.
But that just means it got lucky, right? They had a nice problem that looked big, or not. Did they? One way you could argue that is say no, they helped it look big, right? They overstated the problem in order that people got freaked out about it and actually did something. Remember, we want to separate out: is it a good treaty or did it pick a good problem to work on, right? Look at how successful I am. I picked a really easy problem to work, and I solved it. Whereas maybe the whaling problem, and this is something you do want to kind of control for. How hard is the problem? And that part of the real issue here that David's well aware of is part of the real problem with doing what we're trying to do, is relative effectiveness, is you better control for hardness of problem. On a scale of 1 to 10, only compare problems that are the same, right? And don't compare how effective was a treaty working a problem that was a 1 level of hardness with one that was a 10 level of hardness. So I think this raises a really important point about, hey, to really assess this, you'd have to think about how hard was the problem each of them were solving, and how well did it do given how hard it was. Kate.
Well, I guess I was impressed by the Montreal Protocol because of its age and how quickly it's become effective. But like looking at it today, I would choose the Whaling Treaty just because it's reached the 0 level as opposed to this phase out deal, which I think is just easier to enforce and easier to get rid of the illegal aspects.
Okay. Good. Emily?
Okay. I agree with Eli that probably if we hadn't had a whaling agreement, stocks would, crash. People would figure out what to do, maybe leave them alone, and something, perhaps we'd have a whaling industry now. Who knows? But I don't agree with Megan when she says that the countries probably would have cut their CFC use without the Montreal Protocol, especially developing countries that have bigger problems to deal with. And I wouldn't see any reason why they would want to worry about the ozone hole when they wouldn't, it's not really something that's occurring at this moment. Like the Montreal Protocol was a precautionary, obviously there's an ozone hole, but sort of down the line, yeah, we're all going to get skin cancer and there's going to be these problems, but right now that might not have been an issue for developing countries. I thought in general it was pretty impressive in terms of the Montreal Protocol to get passed just because of that precautionary measure, and just that there's the issue of developing and developed countries and having to deal with those differences.
Okay.
So I think it was a harder issue to tackle in terms of a treaty for sure.
Okay, good. I want David to have a last word.
Let me cast my vote. The Whaling Treaty is not irrelevant. The firms would not have fixed this problem, the problem of overdepletion of the stocks on their own. There's essentially no case, a couple partial exceptions, where in managing a fishery, for example, where the fishermen have figured out how to do this on their own. The Spanish fishing boats would find the last cod in the North Atlantic if it took them the entire GNP of Spain. It's just, there are people who are in the fishing business go after everything and they do not stop until it is all dead. So the whaling regime has had some effect on that, no question. My vote is clearly with the ozone regime, though. In the advanced industrialized countries, if you blew up the ozone regime, those countries would phase out essentially all of their chlorofluorocarbons anyway, in part because of public pressure, but in part because the ozone regime has helped them coordinate their behavior, because some of this is really costly and is really complicated, like getting chlorofluorocarbons out of asthmatic inhalers is really technically complicated, requires a lot of technical coordination, and all that happens inside the ozone regime. Wouldn't happen autonomously on its own. But the big story there is not the industrialized countries, it's developing countries. And I think there's no question that developing countries would not be phasing out ozone depleting substances if not for this regime, because it delivers both the money and the threat of sanctions, which has never been used, but it delivers the threat, and that's what holds the regime together. So that's why my vote is with the ozone regime.